When tech millionaire Sebastian Morrison publicly humiliated his farmer brother at their father's estate, reading and laughed at his inheritance of a worthless lame ox, he had no idea he was mocking a $2.8 billion agricultural discovery that would expose centuries-old breeding secrets, trigger an international genetic revolution, and reveal how modern agriculture had systematically destroyed the most valuable livestock bloodlines in human history, while his backward brother held the key to solving global food security through ancient farming wisdom, that biotechnology corporations had been desperately searching for over 3 decades. Before we dive into this incredible story that will completely change how you think about family, judgment, and hidden value, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story grabs your attention, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happened when Sebastian Morrison laughed at his brother's pathetic inheritance and how it triggered a scientific discovery that would make international headlines will absolutely blow your mind. A tech mogul whose arrogance about traditional farming would cost him everything, while his humble farmer brother's faith in their grandfather's wisdom would unlock agricultural secrets that universities and corporations had been desperately searching for over 3 decades. But let's start from the beginning. The Morrison farm had been more than just agricultural land. For over a century it had been the testing ground for breeding innovations that defied conventional wisdom and challenged every assumption that modern agricultural science held about livestock genetics and sustainable protein production. What appeared to outsiders as a modest 280-acre family operation in Madison County, Wisconsin, actually represented 4 generations of systematic breeding experimentation that had preserved genetic lineages that corporate agriculture had systematically eliminated through industrial farming practices and profit-driven breeding programs. William Bill Morrison, family patriarch who had passed away 3 months earlier at age 78, had dedicated his entire adult life to preserving what he called the old bloodlines livestock genetics that his own grandfather had, brought from the Piedmont region of Italy in 1892, along with breeding knowledge that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. Before modern agricultural science had even begun to understand the complexity of animal genetics and sustainable farming practices, the Morrison family's commitment to traditional breeding practices had made them outcasts in their own agricultural community, where corporate farming methods and industrial livestock production had gradually replaced the careful, patient breeding programs that required generations of dedication and systematic observation to achieve results that couldn't be measured in quarterly profit reports or annual production statistics. Bill Morrison's detailed breeding records, maintained in handwritten journals spanning 57 years, documented genetic observations and livestock behavior patterns that contradicted every principle of modern agricultural efficiency, but which had produced animals with extraordinary characteristics that industrial breeding programs had never been able to replicate, despite billions of dollars in research and genetic manipulation technology. The centerpiece of Bill Morrison's breeding program was a bloodline that traced back to his great-grandfather's original Pedemnitz cattle imports, animals that had been specifically selected not for size or rapid weight gain, but for muscular development, disease resistance, and what Bill called genetic resilience, characteristics that modern agricultural science had systematically bred out of commercial livestock in favor of rapid growth and high production yields. Sebastian Morrison had been born into agricultural heritage, but had rejected it from his earliest memories, viewing the farm as a symbol of economic limitation and social backwardness that prevented his family from achieving the kind of financial success and social status that he observed in urban professional families whose children attended private schools and pursued careers in technology, finance, and other industries that generated substantial wealth and social recognition. From the moment Sebastian had earned admission to Stanford University with a full academic scholarship in computer science, he had systematically distanced himself from his agricultural background, telling classmates and professors that his family was in business, rather than acknowledging the farming heritage that had actually provided the work ethic and analytical thinking that enabled his academic success and technological innovation. Sebastian's transformation from farm boy to tech mogul had been driven by systematic rejection of everything associated with traditional agriculture, including the patient, long-term thinking that characterized successful farming operations, the respect for natural processes that couldn't be artificially accelerated, and the understanding that some forms of value couldn't be measured in immediate financial returns or quarterly profit statements. The Stanford years had reinforced Sebastian's belief that technological innovation and data-driven decision-making represented superior approaches to problem-solving compared to the traditional knowledge and intuitive understanding that characterized his family's agricultural practices, leading him to view farming as an outdated profession that would eventually be completely replaced by automated systems and artificial intelligence. Sebastian's senior thesis project had focused on developing precision agriculture software that could optimize crop yields through satellite imagery, weather data analysis, and algorithmic planting recommendations. But his sophisticated technological approach had systematically ignored the livestock breeding knowledge and sustainable farming practices that his own family had developed through generations of hands-on experience and careful observation. After graduation, Sebastian had founded Morrison Digital Solutions in a Palo Alto garage, developing agricultural automation software that promised to revolutionize farming through technological efficiency and data-driven optimization, but which actually served corporate agricultural interests by standardizing farming practices and eliminating the kind of traditional knowledge and specialized breeding programs that his own family had preserved. The success of Morrison Digital Solutions had validated Sebastian's belief that technological innovation was superior to traditional farming methods, with corporate clients throughout the Midwest implementing his software systems to increase production efficiency and reduce labor costs, while systematically eliminating the small-scale, specialized farming operations that maintained genetic diversity and traditional breeding knowledge. Sebastian's personal wealth had grown to over $340 million by his 40th birthday, enabling him to purchase a $4.5 million penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast district, drive luxury vehicles, and maintain the kind of sophisticated urban lifestyle that represented everything he had wanted to escape from his agricultural childhood and rural Wisconsin background. The irony of Sebastian's agricultural technology business was that his sophisticated software systems and precision farming algorithms had contributed to the systematic destruction of exactly the kind of traditional farming knowledge and specialized breeding programs that his own family had preserved. While generating massive profits for corporate agricultural operations that prioritize short-term production over long-term genetic sustainability, Sebastian's public statements about agriculture consistently emphasized efficiency, technology, and corporate scale as the solutions to global food challenges, while dismissing traditional farming methods and family operations as economically obsolete and scientifically backward approaches that couldn't compete with modern industrial agriculture and technological innovation. Meanwhile, Daniel Morrison had chosen a completely different path, remaining on the family farm after high school and dedicating himself to learning everything his father and grandfather could teach him about traditional breeding practices, sustainable agriculture, and the careful observation skills that enabled successful livestock management without technological assistance or industrial farming methods. Daniel's education had occurred in barns and pastures rather than lecture halls, with his curriculum consisting of daily animal care, seasonal farming cycles, and the systematic study of livestock behavior and genetic characteristics that couldn't be learned from textbooks or academic programs but required years of hands-on experience and patient observation. The 20-year-old Daniel had never earned a college degree or achieved the kind of financial success that impressed urban professionals, but his understanding of animal genetics and sustainable farming practices exceeded that of most agricultural science professors and corporate livestock specialists who relied on technological systems. Rather than direct observation and traditional knowledge, Daniel's commitment to preserving his grandfather's breeding programs had been viewed by local farmers as economically irrational, since traditional breeding methods required longer time horizons and generated lower immediate profits compared to industrial livestock production and artificial insemination, programs that prioritized rapid growth and standardized characteristics. The Morrison farm under Daniel's management had maintained profitability. Through direct marketing of specialty agricultural products and custom breeding services for other farmers who valued genetic diversity and traditional livestock characteristics, but these niche markets generated modest income compared to the massive profits available through corporate agricultural contracts and industrial farming operations. Daniel's lifestyle reflected traditional rural values and economic modesty. Living in the same farmhouse where his father and grandfather had been born, driving used pickup trucks, and maintaining social connections within the local farming community. Rather than pursuing the kind of professional networking and wealth accumulation that characterized his brother's urban business career, the contrast between the two brothers had become increasingly pronounced over the years, with Sebastian viewing Daniel as economically unsuccessful and intellectually limited, while Daniel saw Sebastian as having abandoned family values and agricultural wisdom in pursuit of financial gain and social status that came at the expense of traditional knowledge and community connections. Family gatherings had become tense affairs where Sebastian would lecture Daniel about the economic inefficiency of traditional farming methods while promoting corporate agricultural automation, completely unaware that his technological solutions were systematically destroying the genetic diversity and traditional knowledge that his own family had spent generations developing and preserving. The 42nd floor of Cromwell & Associates law firm provided a spectacular view of Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the morning sunlight across, polished marble floors and mahogany conference tables that had witnessed thousands of estate readings over the firm's 127-year history, but none that would have the far-reaching consequences that would result from the Morrison family's inheritance dispute and the systematic undervaluation of traditional agricultural assets. Senior partner Margaret Pemberton Clark had been handling Morrison family legal affairs for over 30 years. Having witnessed the gradual transformation of American agriculture from family operations to corporate consolidation, but she had never encountered an estate division that would ultimately expose the economic value of traditional farming knowledge and specialized breeding programs that modern agricultural science had systematically overlooked. The conference room's formal atmosphere reflected the kind of professional dignity appropriate for dividing substantial family assets. But the underlying tension between Sebastian and Daniel Morrison suggested deeper conflicts about family values, agricultural heritage, and the fundamental question of what constituted real value in modern American society. Sebastian's appearance at the estate reading reflected his systematic effort to distance himself from his agricultural background. Wearing a custom-tailored $3,000 Armani suit, Italian leather shoes, and a platinum Rolex Submariner that cost more than most farmers earned in 6 months while maintaining the kind of sophisticated professional demeanor that characterized successful tech executives and urban business leaders. The 42-year-old tech mogul had arrived at the law firm in his $180,000 Tesla Model S Plaid, having flown from San Francisco specifically for the estate reading before returning to oversee a crucial software deployment for corporate agricultural clients who relied on his precision farming algorithms to optimize crop yields and reduce labor costs. Sebastian's obvious impatience with the formal legal procedures reflected his systematic bias toward technological efficiency and automated systems that could accelerate traditional processes, completely failing to understand that some forms of value required patient development and couldn't be optimized through artificial acceleration or data-driven manipulation. Daniel Morrison's appearance provided a stark contrast to his brother's sophisticated urban presentation. Wearing clean but worn work clothes that reflected practical farming requirements rather than professional image management. With calloused hands and weathered skin that demonstrated decades of outdoor labor and hands-on livestock management, the 20-year-old farmer had driven to Chicago in his 2008 Ford F-150 pickup truck. Having completed morning farm chores before making the 3-hour journey to attend their father's estate reading, completely unaware that his inheritance would soon be validated by scientific discoveries that would transform international understanding of agricultural genetics and traditional breeding wisdom. Margaret Pemberton Clark opened the leather-bound will with appropriate solemnity, recognizing that the document represented not only financial assets, but also the culmination of 4 generations of Morrison family agricultural heritage and the systematic preservation of traditional farming knowledge that had been increasingly undervalued by modern agricultural economics. The estate of William Morrison includes agricultural land, livestock, farm equipment, investments, and personal property valued at approximately $4.2 million. Margaret announced with professional precision, completely unaware that the most valuable asset in the estate had been systematically undervalued by conventional agricultural assessment methods and traditional livestock appraisal procedures. To my eldest son, Sebastian, Margaret read from the meticulously prepared document. I leave my investment portfolio, including stocks, bonds, municipal securities, and savings accounts totaling $1.8 million, as well as the family residence, in surrounding 15 acres. Recognizing his success in modern business and his demonstrated preference for financial assets over agricultural operations, Sebastian's satisfied expression reflected his expectation that his financial success and sophisticated business acumen had earned him the most valuable portions of his father's estate, completely failing to recognize that his systematic dismissal of traditional farming practices had cost him access to agricultural innovations whose true value exceeded his entire tech company's current market capitalization. The financial inheritance that Sebastian would receive included blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and conservative investments that his father had accumulated through decades of careful financial management, providing immediate liquidity and passive income that would supplement Sebastian's existing wealth, while requiring no agricultural knowledge or traditional farming experience. To my younger son Daniel, Margaret continued with growing recognition of the document's deeper implications. I leave the remaining 265 acres of farmland, all agricultural equipment, including tractors, combines, and specialized farming implements. The complete livestock operation, including cattle, pigs, and poultry, and specifically, I leave him ownership and complete responsibility for Titan, the Piedmontese bull, with the explicit written instruction that this animal represents the culmination of our family's breeding expertise and should be treated with the respect and care that his unique genetics deserve. The specific mention of Titan, the Piedmontese bull, was accompanied by additional documentation that Margaret had never encountered in previous estate readings, including detailed breeding records, genetic lineage charts, and what appeared to be scientific correspondence with agricultural universities and research institutions that suggested unusual interest in the Morrison family's livestock breeding program. Daniel's inheritance represented everything associated with traditional farming operations: land that required constant maintenance and improvement, equipment that needed regular repair and replacement, livestock that demanded daily care and veterinary attention, and the ongoing responsibility for preserving breeding programs that generated modest immediate income while requiring long-term commitment and specialized knowledge. The contrast between the two inheritances seemed to confirm conventional assumptions about modern economic value, with Sebastian receiving liquid financial assets that provided immediate wealth and passive income, while Daniel inherited agricultural operations that required constant labor and generated uncertain profits dependent on weather, market conditions, and the unpredictable challenges of farming in an increasingly corporate-dominated agricultural economy. But it was the specific mention of Titan, the Piedmontese bull, that triggered Sebastian's most devastating display of arrogance and family cruelty, as his accumulated resentment toward traditional farming and his systematic dismissal of agricultural heritage combined with his sophisticated ignorance about life. That thing has been limping around the farm for years, Sebastian continued with escalating mockery that demonstrated complete ignorance about livestock genetics, traditional breeding practices, and the specialized characteristics that distinguished valuable breeding animals from conventional commercial livestock. What are you supposed to do with a disabled bull that probably can't even breed properly? Use him as a very expensive lawn ornament? Margaret Pemberton Clark's obvious discomfort with Sebastian's public ridicule reflected professional recognition that family estate readings should be conducted with dignity and respect. But Sebastian's arrogance and systematic contempt for traditional farming practices prevented him from recognizing the inappropriate nature of his behavior or the deeper implications of his father's specific instructions. Regarding Titan's care and breeding program, I mean, seriously, Danny? Sebastian's voice carried devastating finality as he prepared to deliver his most crushing assessment of his brother's inheritance and traditional farming prospects. This is 2022. We have genetic testing, artificial insemination, and precision breeding programs. Your special bull is probably just inbred and defective. Grandpa's old wives' tales about special bloodlines don't mean anything in the real world. Daniel's composed response reflected the dignity and restraint that characterized traditional farming families who understood the long-term value of patience and careful stewardship. Completely unaware that his quiet acceptance of Sebastian's ridicule was about to be vindicated by scientific discoveries that would transform international understanding of agricultural genetics and validate generations of Morrison family breeding wisdom. Titan isn't lame, Seb. Daniel replied with quiet firmness that reflected decades of working with livestock and understanding animal behavior that couldn't be learned from technological systems or corporate agricultural training programs. He has a unique gait because of his muscle development. Grandpa always said there was something special about his bloodline, something that modern breeding had lost. Sebastian's dismissive laughter intensified as he demonstrated the kind of sophisticated ignorance that characterized successful professionals, who assumed their technological expertise qualified them to judge traditional practices without understanding the complexity and specialized knowledge that traditional farming required. Something special? Sebastian's mockery reached new levels of family cruelty as he systematically dismissed generations of Morrison farming wisdom and traditional breeding knowledge. Like what? Magical farming powers? Divine bovine intervention? Come on, Danny, you're talking like some kind of agricultural mystic. The systematic nature of Sebastian's ridicule reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of how traditional breeding programs worked. The patient observation skills required for identifying valuable genetic characteristics and the specialized knowledge that enabled traditional farmers to preserve livestock traits that industrial agriculture systematically eliminated through profit-driven breeding practices. I'm sure you'll do great with your limping livestock and your 19th century farming methods, Sebastian concluded with devastating finality.
Yes.
As he gathered his expensive briefcase and prepared to leave the conference room. Just don't come asking for loans when your special bull operation goes bankrupt like every other small farm in Wisconsin. The cruelty of Sebastian's final statement reflected not only his systematic bias against traditional farming, but also his complete failure to recognize that his own agricultural technology business had contributed to the economic pressures that were forcing small farms out of business, while consolidating agricultural operations under corporate control that prioritized efficiency over genetic diversity and traditional knowledge. Daniel's quiet acceptance of his brother's systematic humiliation demonstrated the kind of personal strength and family loyalty that characterized traditional farming communities, completely unaware that his faith in their grandfather's wisdom and his commitment to preserving traditional breeding practices was about to be validated by one of the most significant agricultural discoveries in modern history. As Sebastian Morrison left the law office with supreme confidence in his financial inheritance and obvious contempt for his brother's agricultural assets, he had no idea that his mockery of the lame ox had just cost him access to genetic innovations that would soon be valued at over $2.8 billion while transforming international understanding of sustainable agriculture and livestock breeding. The pathetic bull that Sebastian had dismissed as worthless represented the culmination of 4 generations of Morrison family breeding expertise, carrying genetic markers that agricultural scientists and biotechnology corporations had been desperately searching for throughout decades of research into sustainable protein production, climate-resistant livestock development, and the preservation of genetic diversity that industrial agriculture had systematically eliminated. The irony of Sebastian's dismissive attitude was that his own agricultural technology company had been developing precision breeding algorithms designed to identify exactly the kind of genetic characteristics that Titan possessed, but his sophisticated technological systems had been unable to recognize. the value that his own family had preserved through traditional breeding methods and patient observation over multiple generations. Within 2 years, Sebastian's arrogance and systematic dismissal of traditional farming wisdom would cost him everything he valued most: of his business reputation, his financial security, and his family relationships, while as humble farmer. Brothers' respect for family heritage and agricultural tradition would unlock scientific discoveries that would make international headlines and establish the Morrison farm as the center of agricultural innovation that could help solve global food security challenges. The estate reading that had seemed to confirm conventional assumptions about modern economic value would ultimately expose how thoroughly traditional agricultural knowledge had been undervalued by modern economic systems, technological assessment methods, and sophisticated professional judgment that ignored the complexity and specialized expertise that traditional farming required. But on that September morning in 2022, as Sebastian Morrison walked out of the law firm with supreme confidence in his superior intelligence and obvious contempt for his brother's backward inheritance, he had no idea that he had just made the most expensive mistake of his life, dismissing agricultural innovations that would soon revolutionize global food production and transform the Morrison family farm into the most valuable agricultural operation in American history. Before we continue with this incredible story that will completely transform how you think about family judgment, hidden value, it's the dangerous cost of arrogance, we want to know where you're watching from around the world. Drop your location in the comments below. You watching from the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, or somewhere else entirely? We love connecting with our global community and seeing how these universal stories of family conflict and unexpected revelations resonate with people from different cultures and backgrounds. And if this story has already grabbed your attention with Sebastian's devastating mockery of his brother's inheritance, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to discover about Titan, the lame ox, and the Morrison family's agricultural secrets will absolutely blow your mind in ways that will challenge everything you thought you knew about traditional farming, genetic science, and the incredible value that can be hidden in plain sight for decades. This isn't just another story about family conflict or sibling rivalry. What you're about to witness is one of the most shocking reversals of fortune in modern agricultural history, where sophisticated technology and urban wealth prove completely worthless compared to traditional knowledge and rural wisdom that has been systematically undervalued by our modern economy and corporate agricultural systems. What Sebastian Morrison dismissed as a worthless lame ox in that Chicago law office will soon be revealed as carrying genetic markers that biotechnology corporations have spent over $340 million trying to artificially recreate in laboratory settings, while Daniel Morrison has been caring for these exact genetic characteristics through traditional breeding methods that his great-grandfather brought from Italy over 130 years ago. But the story gets even more incredible than genetic science and agricultural innovation, because Sebastian's mockery of his brother's inheritance is about to trigger a chain of events that will expose how modern agricultural technology, despite all its sophistication and data-driven precision, has been systematically destroying the exact genetic diversity and traditional breeding knowledge that could solve global food security challenges and revolutionize sustainable protein production. The irony goes even deeper than you can imagine. Sebastian's own agricultural technology company, Morrison Digital Solutions, has been developing artificial intelligence algorithms specifically designed to identify the genetic characteristics that Titan possesses naturally, while Sebastian himself has been completely blind to the fact that his own family farm has been preserving the exact agricultural innovations that his sophisticated software systems have been desperately trying to recreate through technological manipulation. We're about to take you on a journey through the hidden world of agricultural genetics, traditional breeding wisdom, and scientific discoveries that will reveal how corporate farming and technological innovation have systematically eliminated genetic diversity in pursuit of short-term profits, while families like the Morrisons have been quietly preserving livestock bloodlines that represent the future of sustainable agriculture and climate-resistant food production. What most people don't realize is that modern agriculture is facing a genetic crisis that threatens global food security in ways that corporate, agricultural systems and government agencies have been systematically concealing from public awareness. While traditional farming families like the Morrisons have been unknowingly preserving the genetic solutions that could prevent agricultural collapse and feed growing global populations, the livestock industry has undergone systematic genetic narrowing over the past 50 years. With corporate breeding programs focusing exclusively on rapid growth, high production yields, and standardized characteristics that maximize short-term profits while eliminating genetic diversity that provides disease resistance, climate adaptability, and sustainable reproduction that traditional breeding programs maintained through patient, long-term selection processes, industrial agriculture has created what scientists call genetic bottlenecks in major livestock populations, where millions of animals share identical genetic profiles that make them vulnerable to disease outbreaks, climate changes, and environmental stresses that could potentially destroy entire food production systems within months of a major agricultural crisis or biological threat. The Holstein dairy cattle that dominate modern milk production represent one of the most extreme examples of genetic narrowing, with over 95% of American dairy cows descended from fewer than 100 breeding bulls, creating unprecedented vulnerability to genetic diseases and environmental challenges that traditional dairy farming had successfully managed through genetic diversity and traditional breeding practices. Commercial beef production has followed similar patterns of genetic consolidation, with corporate breeding programs eliminating traditional breeds and specialized bloodlines in favor of standardized animals that grow rapidly in industrial feeding operations but lack the disease resistance, climate adaptability, and reproductive longevity that traditional cattle possess through centuries of careful breeding and natural selection. Poultry production represents perhaps the most extreme example of genetic manipulation, with commercial chickens bred for such rapid growth that they often cannot survive past their intended slaughter age, requiring constant antibiotic treatment, and climate-controlled environments that make industrial poultry operations completely dependent on technological intervention and pharmaceutical support. The systematic elimination of genetic diversity in commercial livestock has created agricultural systems that appear highly efficient in ideal conditions, but are extremely vulnerable to disruption from disease outbreaks, climate changes, supply chain interruptions, or any deviation from the controlled environments that industrial agriculture requires for maintaining production levels. Traditional farming families throughout the world have been unknowingly serving as genetic reservoirs, preserving livestock bloodlines and breeding knowledge that maintained genetic diversity. Through traditional selection methods that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term production gains. But these traditional operations have been systematically displaced by corporate agriculture and modern economic pressures. The Morrison family farm represents exactly the kind of genetic preservation that agricultural scientists are now recognizing as crucial for maintaining food security and developing climate-resistant agriculture. But traditional farming operations, like theirs, have been systematically undervalued by modern agricultural economics and dismissed as economically inefficient by technological systems and corporate farming advocates. What Sebastian Morrison couldn't possibly have understood during his cruel mockery of Titan is that Piedmontese cattle represent one of the most genetically unique breeds in agricultural history, carrying genetic mutations that produce extraordinary muscle development, disease resistance, and protein efficiency that modern biotechnology has been attempting to recreate through genetic engineering and laboratory manipulation. The specific genetic characteristic that gives Piedmontese cattle their distinctive muscle development is called myostatin inhibition, a natural genetic mutation that allows these animals to develop lean muscle mass at rates that exceed all other cattle breeds while maintaining superior meat quality and requiring fewer resources per pound of protein production than conventional beef cattle. Myostatin is a protein that normally limits muscle growth in mammals. But Piedmontese cattle carry a natural genetic mutation that reduces myostatin activity, allowing them to develop what scientists call double muscling muscle development. That appears almost unnatural, but actually represents one of the most efficient forms of protein production that exists in nature. The lame gait that Sebastian mocked is evidence of Titan's defectiveness is actually the visible result of extraordinary muscle development that makes these animals appear to move differently than conventional cattle, but which actually indicates superior genetic characteristics that biotechnology corporations have spent hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to artificially recreate. Biotechnology companies like Recombinetics, eGenesis, and Aquabounty Technologies have been investing massive resources in developing genetic engineering techniques that could introduce myostatin inhibition into commercial livestock populations. But their artificial approaches have been unable to replicate the natural genetic balance that traditional Piedmontese bloodlines maintain through centuries of careful breeding. The pharmaceutical industry has recognized myostatin inhibition as a potential treatment for human muscle-wasting diseases, leading to the development of experimental drugs that attempt to recreate the genetic effects that Piedmontese cattle possess naturally, with several biotechnology companies pursuing FDA approval for myostatin inhibitor medications that could treat muscular dystrophy and age-related muscle loss. Agricultural research institutions throughout the world have been studying Piedmontese genetics as a potential solution to global protein shortages. Since these animals can produce significantly more lean meat per unit of feed and land use than conventional cattle, while requiring fewer resources and generating lower environmental impact than industrial beef production systems. The European Union has invested over 180 million euros in research programs designed to understand and preserve traditional livestock genetics, recognizing that breeds like Piedmontese cattle represent irreplaceable genetic resources that could be crucial for developing sustainable agriculture and addressing climate change challenges that threaten conventional food production systems. Climate change research has identified livestock adaptability as one of the most critical factors for maintaining food security in changing environmental conditions. With traditional breeds like Piedmontese cattle demonstrating superior heat tolerance, disease resistance, and reproductive efficiency compared to commercial livestock that have been bred for optimal performance only in controlled industrial environments. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has classified traditional livestock breeds as genetic resources for food and agriculture, recognizing that genetic diversity maintained by traditional farming families represents crucial insurance against agricultural collapse and the foundation for developing climate-resistant food production systems. What makes Titan's genetics even more extraordinary is that the Morrison family's breeding program has maintained genetic diversity within their Piedmontese bloodline through traditional selection methods that preserved multiple genetic advantages, while avoiding the inbreeding problems that have affected some purebred populations, creating what geneticists call hybrid vigor within a traditional breed framework. While Sebastian Morrison was building his agricultural technology empire and dismissing traditional farming as economically obsolete, biotechnology corporations and pharmaceutical companies were quietly spending billions of dollars searching for exactly the genetic characteristics that his family's farm had. It's been preserving through 4 generations of traditional breeding and careful livestock management. Recombinetics, a Minnesota-based agricultural biotechnology company, has raised over $45 million in venture capital, funding specifically to develop gene editing techniques that could introduce myostatin inhibition into commercial cattle populations, attempting to artificially recreate the genetic advantages that Piedmontese cattle possess naturally through traditional breeding programs. The company's research programs have included partnerships with major agricultural corporations like Genus plc and Zoetis, with combined research budgets exceeding $120 million, annually focused on developing genetic modifications that could revolutionize livestock production through technological intervention rather than traditional breeding methods. eGenesis, a biotechnology company backed by pharmaceutical giant Novo Nordisk, has been developing xenotransplantation research programs that study myostatin inhibition as a potential solution for growing human-compatible organs in genetically modified livestock, with research applications that could transform both agricultural production and medical treatment if successfully developed. Aquabounty Technologies, the first company to receive FDA approval for genetically modified food animals, has been expanding their genetic engineering research to include livestock applications that could introduce myostatin inhibition and other beneficial genetic characteristics into commercial animal populations through laboratory manipulation rather than traditional breeding. The pharmaceutical industry's interest in myostatin inhibition extends far beyond agricultural applications, with companies like Pfizer, Novartis, and Roche investing hundreds of millions of dollars in developing therapeutic applications that could treat human muscle-wasting diseases, age-related muscle loss, and metabolic disorders through medications that recreate the genetic effects naturally present in Piedmontese cattle. Acceleron Pharma, now part of Merck & Co., developed a CEO31, an experimental myostatin inhibitor that reached Phase 2 clinical trials for treating muscular dystrophy before being discontinued due to safety concerns, demonstrating both the potential value and the technical challenges of artificially recreating genetic effects that traditional livestock breeds maintain naturally. Scholar Rock, a biotechnology company focused on muscle growth regulation, has raised over $380 million in funding to develop myostatin pathway modulators for treating neuromuscular diseases, with their research directly studying the genetic mechanisms that Piedmontese cattle demonstrate through natural breeding rather than pharmaceutical intervention. The agricultural implications of successful myostatin manipulation could be worth tens of billions of dollars annually, with potential applications including more efficient beef production, reduced environmental impact from livestock operations, improved protein security for growing global populations, decreased dependence on industrial feeding operations that require massive resource inputs. Corporate agricultural giants like Cargill, Tyson Foods, and JBS have been quietly investing in biotechnology partnerships and genetic research programs that could revolutionize livestock production, with particular interest in technologies that could increase protein efficiency and reduce the environmental footprint of industrial animal agriculture. The venture capital industry has identified agricultural biotechnology as one of the fastest-growing investment sectors, with over $4.2 billion invested in agricultural technology companies during 2021 alone, much of it focused on genetic innovations that could transform livestock production and address global food security challenges. Investment firms like Flagship Pioneering, Khosla Ventures, and Breakthrough Energy Ventures have been systematically funding biotechnology companies that focus on agricultural applications, recognizing that genetic innovations in livestock production could generate massive returns while addressing global challenges related to food security and environmental sustainability. The irony of this massive corporate and investment interest is that traditional farming families like the Morrisons have been preserving and developing exactly the genetic resources that biotechnology companies are spending billions trying to artificially recreate, while being systematically displaced by industrial agriculture and economic pressures that fail to recognize the value of traditional breeding knowledge. What Sebastian Morrison never understood during his years of promoting corporate agricultural automation is that traditional farming communities throughout the world maintain informal networks of genetic preservation and breeding knowledge that represent one of humanity's most valuable but least recognized intellectual and biological resources. The Morrison family's connection to traditional Piedmontese breeding extends far beyond their own farm to include relationships with other traditional livestock families throughout the upper Midwest, Canada, and even back to the original breeding families in the Piedmont region of Italy, creating an informal but sophisticated network of genetic preservation that operates completely outside corporate agricultural systems. Traditional livestock breeders maintain detailed breeding records, genetic observations, and animal performance data that often spans multiple generations and provides insights into livestock genetics that formal agricultural research has never systematically studied or documented, representing a vast reservoir of practical knowledge that academic institutions and corporate researchers have systematically ignored. The European traditional breeding community includes families that have maintained specialized livestock genetics for hundreds of years, preserving genetic diversity and breeding knowledge that predates modern agricultural science, but which often produces superior results compared to corporate breeding programs that focus exclusively on short-term production optimization. Italian agricultural families in the Piedmont region maintain breeding cooperatives and informal research networks that have been studying and preserving traditional livestock genetics for centuries, developing sophisticated understanding of animal breeding that combines traditional knowledge with modern genetic science in ways that corporate agriculture has never attempted. Canadian traditional livestock families, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, have been developing breeding programs that combine traditional European genetics with North American livestock management, creating hybrid approaches that maintain genetic diversity while adapting to modern agricultural conditions and market requirements. American traditional livestock communities, especially in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, maintain informal networks that share breeding knowledge, genetic resources, and livestock management techniques that have been developed through generations of practical experience and careful observation rather than formal agricultural education or corporate training programs. The knowledge transfer systems that operate within traditional livestock communities include apprenticeship relationships, family-based learning, and informal mentorship that preserves breeding expertise and livestock management skills that cannot be learned from textbooks or corporate training programs but require years of hands-on experience and patient observation. Traditional livestock breeders often maintain multiple breeds and genetic lines simultaneously, preserving genetic diversity through careful selection and crossbreeding programs that balance genetic advantages, avoiding the inbreeding problems that affect some purebred populations and the genetic narrowing that characterizes corporate livestock production. The economic value of traditional breeding knowledge has been systematically underestimated by modern agricultural economics, which focus on short-term production metrics rather than long-term genetic sustainability, disease resistance, and adaptability that traditional breeding programs maintain through patient selection and careful livestock management. Research institutions are beginning to recognize that traditional livestock communities possess genetic resources and breeding knowledge that could be crucial for addressing climate change, developing disease, livestock, and maintaining food security in changing environmental conditions that challenge conventional agricultural systems. The United Nations and various international agricultural organizations have begun documenting traditional livestock breeds and breeding knowledge as part of global efforts to preserve genetic diversity for food and agriculture, recognizing that traditional farming communities maintain irreplaceable resources that could be essential for future food security. The supreme irony of Sebastian Morrison's dismissive attitude toward his brother's traditional farming inheritance is that his own agricultural technology company, Morrison Digital Solutions, had been developing sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms specifically designed to identify and replicate the exact genetic characteristics that Titan possessed through natural breeding rather than technological intervention. Morrison Digital Solutions' flagship product, AgriGenetic Pro, promised to revolutionize livestock breeding through machine learning algorithms that could analyze genetic data, predict breeding outcomes, and optimize livestock selection for maximum production efficiency, but the system had been unable to identify or replicate the natural genetic advantages that traditional Piedmontese breeding had maintained for centuries. The company's precision agriculture software included genetic analysis modules that processed DNA sequencing data, reproductive performance records, and production metrics to generate breeding recommendations for corporate livestock operations. But these sophisticated algorithms had systematically overlooked the complex genetic interactions that traditional breeding programs managed through practical experience and intuitive understanding. Sebastian's technological approach to livestock genetics assumed that superior breeding outcomes could be achieved through data analysis and algorithmic optimization. But his systems had been unable to replicate the genetic balance and hybrid vigor that traditional breeding programs achieved through patient selection and careful observation of animal behavior and performance. The artificial intelligence systems that Morrison Digital Solutions had developed could process vast amounts of genetic data and identify statistical correlations between genetic markers and production outcomes, but they lacked the practical understanding of animal behavior, environmental adaptation, and long-term genetic sustainability that characterized traditional breeding knowledge. Corporate clients using Morrison digital solutions. Breeding software had achieved short-term production improvements through genetic selection focused on rapid growth and high yields. But their livestock populations had become increasingly vulnerable to disease outbreaks, environmental stresses, and reproductive problems that traditional breeding programs had historically avoided through genetic diversity and natural selection. The technological limitations of Sebastian's agricultural software reflected broader problems with artificial intelligence applications in complex biological systems, where algorithmic optimization based on limited datasets often produces solutions that appear efficient in controlled conditions but fail when confronted with real-world variability and long-term sustainability requirements. Sebastian's confidence in technological solutions had prevented him from recognizing that traditional farming knowledge represented sophisticated problem-solving systems that had been tested and refined through generations of practical application under varying conditions, producing robust solutions that technological systems had been unable to replicate through artificial intelligence or genetic engineering. The machine learning algorithms that Sebastian's company promoted as superior to traditional farming methods were actually dependent on training data derived from industrial agricultural systems that had already eliminated much of the genetic diversity and traditional knowledge that could have improved their performance and reliability. Corporate agricultural operations that had adopted Morrison Digital Solutions precision breeding systems were beginning to experience genetic bottlenecks, disease susceptibility, and reproductive problems that traditional livestock operations had historically avoided, but these problems were often attributed to external factors rather than systematic limitations of technological systems. The venture capital investors who had funded Morrison Digital Solutions were primarily interested in technological scalability and rapid market penetration rather than long-term agricultural sustainability or genetic preservation, creating business incentives that prioritized short-term growth over the patient development and testing that effective agricultural innovations typically required. Sebastian's success in the agricultural technology industry had been built on convincing corporate clients that sophisticated data analysis and algorithmic optimization could replace traditional farming knowledge and livestock expertise. But his technological systems had been systematically inferior to traditional methods in areas that required long-term thinking and holistic understanding of complex biological systems. As Sebastian Morrison celebrated his inheritance of liquid financial assets and continued to build his agricultural technology empire through corporate contracts and venture capital investment, he remained completely unaware that his systematic dismissal of traditional farming wisdom was about to cost him everything he had worked to achieve in the technology industry. The biotechnology research community was beginning to recognize that traditional livestock breeds and breeding knowledge represented irreplaceable genetic resources that could be crucial for addressing global food security challenges, climate change adaptation, and sustainable agriculture development, creating new interest in exactly the kind of traditional farming operations that Sebastian had systematically dismissed as economically obsolete. Agricultural universities throughout the United States and Europe were launching research programs specifically focused on studying traditional livestock genetics and breeding methods, recognizing that conventional agricultural science had systematically overlooked genetic resources and practical knowledge that could revolutionize livestock production and environmental sustainability. International agricultural organizations and government agencies were beginning to develop policies and funding programs designed to preserve traditional livestock breeds and support traditional farming operations that maintain genetic diversity and breeding knowledge that corporate agriculture had systematically eliminated through industrial standardization. The global food security community was recognizing that climate change, disease outbreaks, and environmental degradation posed serious threats to industrial agricultural systems that depended on genetic uniformity in controlled environments, creating new appreciation for traditional farming systems that maintain genetic diversity and environmental adaptability. Biotechnology investors were beginning to shift their focus from purely technological solutions toward hybrid approaches that combine traditional breeding knowledge with modern mots and genetic science. Recognizing that traditional livestock communities possessed genetic resources and practical expertise that technological systems alone could not replicate or replace. Sebastian's agricultural technology company was beginning to face increased competition from biotechnology firms that offered genetic solutions rather than data analysis, with corporate clients becoming interested in genetic improvements that could provide long-term advantages rather than short-term optimization of existing livestock populations. The venture capital community that had funded Sebastian's company was beginning to recognize that agricultural biotechnology and genetic innovation represented potentially more valuable and scalable opportunities than software systems that simply optimized existing agricultural practices without addressing fundamental genetic limitations. Daniel Morrison, working quietly on the family farm with his traditional breeding programs and careful livestock management, was completely unaware that his inheritance of the lame ox would soon attract attention from agricultural researchers, biotechnology companies, genetic scientists who would recognize Titan as representing one of the most valuable genetic resources in modern agriculture. The scientific community was on the verge of discoveries that would revolutionize understanding of livestock genetics and traditional breeding knowledge, creating opportunities for massive economic value and agricultural innovation that would completely transform the relationship between traditional farming and modern agricultural science. Within months of Sebastian's cruel mockery of his brother's inheritance, a chain of events would begin that would expose the true value of traditional farming wisdom while demonstrating the limitations of technological approaches that ignored genetic diversity and traditional knowledge, ultimately leading to one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern agricultural history. But on that September day in 2022, as Sebastian returned to his luxury penthouse and his sophisticated technology business, he had no idea that his dismissal of the lame ox had just cost him access to genetic innovations worth billions of dollars. While his humble farmer brother prepared to care for agricultural assets that would soon transform a global understanding of livestock genetics and sustainable food production, the stage was set for a confrontation between traditional wisdom and modern arrogance, between genetic preservation and technological innovation, between family heritage and corporate success, that would ultimately reveal which approach to agriculture represented the true future of sustainable food production and global food security in an increasingly challenging world. 2 weeks after the devastating estate reading that had left him publicly humiliated and emotionally wounded by his brother's cruel mockery, Daniel Morrison stood in the early morning mist of his inherited farmland, surveying the 265 acres that now represented both his livelihood and his responsibility to preserve for generations of Morrison. Family agricultural heritage that Sebastian had dismissed as economically worthless and intellectually backward. The September morning air carried the familiar sense of hay, livestock, and rich Wisconsin soil that had surrounded Daniel since childhood, providing the kind of sensory comfort and connection to place that urban professionals like Sebastian could never understand or appreciate. Despite their sophisticated lifestyles and accumulated wealth that separated them from direct contact with natural systems and agricultural cycles, Daniel's daily routine began at 5:15 a.m. with livestock feeding, equipment maintenance, and the systematic care of over 180 animals that required individual attention and specialized knowledge that couldn't be learned from textbooks or corporate training programs, but which demanded years of hands-on experience and patient observation of animal behavior and agricultural conditions. The farmhouse that Daniel had inherited, along with the agricultural operation, reflected for generations of Morrison family occupation, with practical modifications and functional improvements that prioritized agricultural efficiency over aesthetic appeal, creating a living space that served farming operations rather than impressing visitors or demonstrating social status. Daniel's personal living conditions reflected the economic realities of traditional farming operations, with modest furnishings, practical clothing, and everyday expenses carefully managed to ensure that available resources could be invested in livestock care equipment maintenance, and agricultural improvements that would maintain productivity and preserve genetic breeding programs. The contrast between Daniel's rural lifestyle and Sebastian's urban luxury was visible in every aspect of their daily existence, from the worn work boots and practical clothing that Daniel required for farming operations to the sophisticated wardrobes and professional accessories that Sebastian used to maintain his technology, industry, image, and social status. Daniel's social connections remained rooted in the local farming community, with relationships based on shared agricultural experiences, mutual assistance during busy seasons, and common understanding of farming challenges that created bonds of practical cooperation rather than competitive networking or professional advancement. The economic pressures that Daniel faced as a traditional farmer reflected broader trends in American agriculture, where corporate consolidation and industrial farming methods had created market conditions that systematically disadvantaged small-scale operations and traditional farming practices that couldn't compete with subsidized industrial agriculture. Daniel's farming operation generated modest annual profits that provided basic living expenses and agricultural reinvestment, but which couldn't support the kind of luxury lifestyle or accumulated wealth that Sebastian enjoyed through his technology, business, and inherited financial assets that required no daily labor or specialized expertise. The daily challenges that Daniel confronted included equipment breakdowns, weather uncertainties, market price fluctuations, and regulatory requirements that demanded constant attention and problem-solving abilities while providing economic returns that barely justified the investment of time, energy, and expertise that successful farming required. Daniel's commitment to preserving his grandfather's breeding programs required additional resources and specialized knowledge that reduced short-term profitability in favor of maintaining genetic diversity and traditional livestock characteristics that conventional agricultural economics couldn't properly value or recognize as economically significant. The isolation that Daniel experienced as a traditional farmer included systematic exclusion from agricultural technology networks, corporate farming associations, and modern agricultural education programs that promoted industrial methods and dismissed traditional farming knowledge as economically inefficient and scientifically obsolete. Local farming communities in Madison County had been steadily declining as economic pressures and corporate consolidation forced traditional farmers to sell their operations to industrial agricultural corporations that converted family farms to standardized production facilities that eliminated traditional breeding programs and specialized livestock operations. Daniel's neighbors included other traditional farming families who struggled with similar economic challenges and social isolation, creating informal support networks that shared equipment, labor, and agricultural knowledge while maintaining farming traditions that were increasingly marginalized by modern agricultural systems. The veterinary care that Daniel's livestock required included specialized knowledge about traditional breeds and genetic characteristics that many modern veterinarians lacked. Since veterinary education programs focus primarily on industrial, livestock, and commercial breeding systems rather than traditional genetic lines and specialized farming practices, Daniel's relationship with local agricultural extension services reflected broader institutional bias toward corporate farming methods and industrial agricultural practices, with government programs and technical assistance designed primarily for large-scale operations rather than traditional family farms that maintain genetic diversity and specialized breeding programs. The financial institutions that served rural communities had been systematically consolidated and corporatized, with lending policies that favored industrial agricultural investments over traditional AGR farming operations that couldn't demonstrate the rapid returns and scalable profits that commercial banking required for agricultural loans and business financing. Daniel's access to agricultural markets was limited by corporate consolidation in food processing and distribution, with traditional farmers increasingly excluded from supply chains that favored large-scale producers and standardized products over specialty livestock and traditional agricultural products that required different handling and marketing approaches. Every morning, Daniel's farm routine included careful attention to Titan, the Piedmontese bull that Sebastian had cruelly dismissed as the lame ox, completely unaware that this remarkable animal represented one of the most genetically valuable livestock specimens in modern agricultural history, carrying genetic characteristics that biotechnology corporations had spent hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to artificially recreate. Titan's appearance immediately distinguished him from conventional cattle. With extraordinary muscle development that created the distinctive gait Sebastian had mocked as evidence of disability, but which actually indicated superior genetic characteristics. That produced lean muscle mass at rates that exceeded all other cattle breeds while maintaining superior meat quality and resource efficiency. The bull's massive frame and unusual muscular development reflected natural myostatin inhibition that allowed him to achieve muscle growth that appeared almost unnatural, but actually represented one of the most efficient forms of protein production that existed in nature, converting feed into lean meat at rates that commercial livestock could never match. Through conventional breeding or nutritional manipulation, Titan's gentle temperament and intelligent behavior contradicted stereotypes about aggressive bulls, demonstrating the kind of manageable personality that made traditional livestock operations practical for family farmers while maintaining the genetic characteristics that produce superior breeding outcomes and livestock performance that industrial breeding programs had been unable to replicate. Daniel's daily care of Titan included specialized feeding, health monitoring, and behavioral observation that required understanding of traditional livestock management and genetic characteristics that couldn't be learned from modern agricultural education or corporate training programs, but which demanded years of practical experience and inherited knowledge. The feeding program that Daniel maintained for Titan focused on traditional feed combinations and nutritional management that supported optimal genetic expression and health maintenance rather than rapid weight gain or industrial production metrics, reflecting agricultural wisdom that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term optimization. Titan's breeding records, maintained in detailed handwritten logs that Daniel had inherited along with the bull, documented genetic lineage and breeding outcomes that traced back to the original Piedmontese imports that Daniel's great-grandfather had brought from Italy in 1892, preserving genetic information that represented over 130 years of careful selection and traditional breeding expertise. The specialized housing that Daniel provided for Titan included climate control and environmental management that supported optimal health and genetic expression while maintaining the kind of individual attention and specialized care that industrial livestock operations could never provide due to scale requirements and standardized management protocols. Titan's exercise and movement patterns reflected his unique muscle development and genetic characteristics, with Daniel providing appropriate pasture management and activity programs that maintained the bull's health and conditioning while allowing natural behaviors that contributed to genetic expression and breeding performance. The veterinary care that Titan required included specialized knowledge about Piedmontese genetics and traditional breed characteristics that few modern veterinarians possessed, forcing Daniel to develop extensive knowledge about livestock health management and genetic-specific care requirements that conventional veterinary training didn't address. Daniel's relationship with Titan reflected the kind of individual animal management and personal connection that characterized traditional livestock operations, where farmers developed detailed knowledge about individual animals and their genetic characteristics rather than managing livestock as standardized production units in industrial systems. The breeding program that Daniel maintained with Titan included careful selection of female cattle that would complement his genetic characteristics and preserve the traditional Piedmontese traits that his family had maintained through 4 generations of patient breeding and genetic preservation. Despite economic pressures that favored commercial livestock and industrial breeding systems, local farmers occasionally brought cattle to be bred with Titan, recognizing the superior quality of offspring that resulted from his genetic characteristics. But few understood the scientific significance or economic value of the traditional breeding program that Daniel was maintaining through his inherited responsibility and family commitment. The economic value that Daniel generated through Titan's breeding services provided modest additional income that helped support the farming operation. But conventional agricultural economics failed to recognize the true genetic value or potential. Biotechnology applications that Titan's genetics represented for future agricultural innovation and sustainable food production. Daniel's documentation of Titan's breeding outcomes included detailed records of offspring performance, genetic characteristics, and livestock quality that demonstrated the superior results achieved through traditional breeding methods compared to industrial livestock production and artificial insemination programs that prioritized quantity over genetic quality. The genetic testing that Daniel had considered for Titan was prohibitively expensive for a traditional farming operation. With commercial genetic analysis services designed primarily for industrial livestock operations and research institutions, rather than family farmers who maintain traditional breeding programs through practical knowledge and inherited expertise, while Daniel struggled with the daily challenges of traditional farming and livestock management, Sebastian Morrison continued to build his technology empire from his luxury penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast district. Completely isolated from agricultural realities and increasingly convinced that his sophisticated business success validated his dismissive attitude toward traditional farming and rural life. Sebastian's daily routine reflected the kind of urban professional lifestyle that prioritized efficiency, technology, and social networking over direct productive labor or specialized technical expertise. With personal assistance, automated systems, and corporate services that eliminated most practical challenges in everyday responsibilities that characterized traditional work, the Morrison Digital Solutions headquarters occupied 15,000 square feet of premium office space in Chicago's technology corridor. With sophisticated computer systems, artificial intelligence development laboratories, and corporate conference facilities that projected the kind of professional success and technological innovation that impressed corporate clients and venture capital investors. Sebastian's office reflected his systematic effort to distance himself from his agricultural background. With modern furniture, abstract art, and technological displays, they created an atmosphere of sophisticated professionalism while completely eliminating any visual references to farming rural life or traditional agricultural heritage that might compromise his technology industry image. The corporate culture that Sebastian had developed at Morrison Digital Solutions emphasized technological innovation, data-driven decision-making, and algorithmic optimization as superior approaches to traditional knowledge and practical experience, creating an organizational environment that systematically devalued exactly the kind of agricultural wisdom that his own family had preserved. Sebastian's management style reflected his confidence in technological solutions and systematic bias against traditional approaches, with corporate policies that promoted automation, artificial intelligence, and data analysis, while dismissing practical knowledge and hands-on expertise as economically inefficient and intellectually inferior methods of problem-solving. The client base that Morrison Digital Solutions served included major corporate agricultural operations like Cargill, Tyson Foods, and Archer Daniels Midland, whose industrial farming systems and profit-driven production methods had systematically displaced exactly the kind of traditional farming operations and genetic preservation programs that Daniel maintained on the family farm. Sebastian's marketing presentations consistently promoted technological superiority over traditional farming methods, with sophisticated sales materials and corporate demonstrations that convinced clients that artificial intelligence and algorithmic optimization could replace agricultural expertise and traditional knowledge while improving efficiency and profitability. The venture capital funding that Morrison Digital Solutions had received totaled over $45 million from prestigious investment firms like Sequoia Capital and Andreessen Horowitz, whose partnership validated Sebastian's belief that technological innovation represented the future of agriculture. While traditional farming methods were economically obsolete and socially backward, Sebastian's personal wealth had grown substantially since the estate reading, with his technology company's valuation increasing to over $380 million. His corporate agricultural clients adopted his precision farming software and artificial intelligence systems that promised to revolutionize agricultural production. Through technological innovation rather than genetic improvement or traditional breeding knowledge, The luxury lifestyle that Sebastian maintained included expensive vehicles, exclusive social clubs, and sophisticated entertainment that reinforced his identity as a successful technology entrepreneur while systematically isolating him from agricultural communities and traditional farming knowledge that could have informed his business development and technical innovation. Sebastian's social connections included other technology executives, venture capital investors, and corporate agricultural leaders who shared his bias toward technological solutions and systematic dismissal of traditional farming methods, creating an echo chamber that reinforced his assumptions about agricultural innovation while preventing exposure to HMCO, alternative approaches, or traditional knowledge. The professional recognition that Sebastian received included technology industry awards, agricultural innovation honors, and corporate leadership recognition that validated his approach to agricultural technology, while completely ignoring the genetic resources and traditional knowledge that his own family had preserved through generations of farming expertise. Sebastian's media appearances and conference presentations consistently promoted corporate agricultural automation and technological optimization as solutions to global food challenges, while systematically dismissing traditional farming and genetic preservation as economically inefficient approaches that couldn't compete with modern industrial agriculture and sophisticated technological systems. The agricultural technology industry that Sebastian dominated included systematic bias toward technological solutions and corporate scalability, with industry networks and professional associations that promoted automation and artificial intelligence, while ignoring traditional farming knowledge and genetic preservation programs that required patient development and specialized expertise. Sebastian's relationship with his corporate agricultural clients included systematic promotion of standardization and technological optimization that eliminated exactly the kind of genetic diversity in traditional breeding programs that could have improved their livestock operations while reducing environmental impact and improving sustainable food production. The weeks following the estate reading had intensified the emotional and philosophical distance between the Morrison brothers, with Sebastian's continued success in the technology industry reinforcing his confidence in modern approaches, while Daniel's commitment to traditional farming isolated him from mainstream agricultural trends and economic opportunities that characterize contemporary agriculture. Sebastian's social media presence included frequent posts about technological innovation, corporate success, and sophisticated urban lifestyle that implicitly criticized traditional approaches in rural life while promoting the kind of modern, professional achievement that attracted admiration from technology, industry, networks, and corporate agricultural leadership. The technology conferences where Sebastian delivered keynote presentations about agricultural innovation consistently promoted corporate solutions and technological automation, while systematically dismissing traditional farming knowledge as economically obsolete, creating professional recognition that reinforced his bias against the agricultural heritage that Daniel was preserving. Daniel's isolation from modern agricultural networks reflected his commitment to traditional farming methods and genetic preservation programs that were increasingly marginalized by corporate agriculture and technological systems that prioritized efficiency over genetic diversity and traditional knowledge. The economic pressures that Daniel faced as a traditional farmer included systematic disadvantages in agricultural markets that favored industrial production and standardized products over specialty livestock and traditional breeding programs that required specialized knowledge and individual attention rather than automated systems and corporate management. Sebastian's venture capital relationships included investors who were systematically funding agricultural technology companies that promoted automation and artificial intelligence while ignoring traditional farming knowledge and genetic preservation. Programs that could have provided more sustainable and environmentally beneficial approaches to agricultural innovation. The corporate agricultural clients that Sebastian served were implementing his technological systems to optimize existing industrial livestock operations while eliminating traditional breeding programs and genetic diversity that could have improved their production, sustainability, and environmental performance through natural genetic advantages rather than technological intervention. Daniel's commitment to preserving traditional breeding programs required personal sacrifices and economic limitations that prevented him from participating in modern agricultural networks and technology adoption that could have improved his farming efficiency while compromising the genetic preservation and traditional knowledge that represented his family's agricultural legacy. The agricultural extension services and government programs that should have supported traditional farming operations like Daniel's were systematically biased toward corporate agriculture and industrial production methods with technical assistance and financial support designed primarily for large-scale operations, rather than family farms that maintained genetic diversity and specialized knowledge. Sebastian's professional success and accumulated wealth enabled him to maintain the kind of sophisticated lifestyle and social connections that reinforced his dismissive attitude toward traditional farming while preventing exposure to agricultural communities and traditional knowledge that could have informed his technology development and business innovation. The farming community that surrounded Daniel included other traditional farmers who faced similar economic challenges and social isolation, creating informal support networks that preserved agricultural knowledge and genetic resources while being systematically marginalized by corporate agriculture and technological systems that dominated modern farming. Daniel's daily responsibilities for livestock care and traditional breeding programs required specialized knowledge and practical expertise that couldn't be automated or optimized through technological systems, demonstrating the continued value of traditional agricultural skills while highlighting the limitations of purely technological approaches to complex biological systems. The genetic resources that Daniel was preserving through his inheritance of Titan and commitment to traditional breeding represented irreplaceable agricultural assets that could be crucial for future food security and sustainable agriculture, but which conventional economic systems and agricultural policies failed to recognize or support through appropriate valuation and institutional assistance. While Sebastian continued to dismiss his brother's agricultural inheritance as economically worthless and intellectually backward, the genetic resources that Daniel was carefully preserving on the Morrison farm were quietly attracting attention from agricultural researchers and biotechnology companies who were beginning to recognize the extraordinary value of traditional livestock breeds and breeding, knowledge that had been systematically overlooked by modern agricultural systems. Agricultural universities throughout the Midwest were launching research programs specifically focused on studying traditional livestock genetics and breeding methods. Recognizing that conventional agricultural science had systematically undervalued genetic resources and practical knowledge that could revolutionize livestock production and environmental sustainability through natural genetic advantages rather than technological intervention, the University of Wisconsin's Department of Animal Sciences began monitoring traditional farming operations throughout the state, documenting genetic resources and breeding programs that maintained livestock diversity and specialized characteristics that could be crucial for developing climate-resistant agriculture and sustainable food production systems that addressed global food security challenges. Biotechnology companies that specialized in agricultural applications were quietly investigating traditional livestock breeds and breeding programs, recognizing that natural genetic variations in traditional knowledge could provide solutions to problems that genetic engineering and laboratory manipulation had been unable to address through purely technological approaches and artificial genetic modification. International agricultural organizations were beginning to develop policies and funding programs designed to preserve traditional livestock breeds and support traditional farming operations that maintained genetic diversity and breeding knowledge that represented irreplaceable resources for future agricultural innovation and global food security. The growing recognition of traditional livestock genetics as valuable agricultural resources was creating new opportunities for farmers like Daniel, who had maintained traditional breeding programs and genetic preservation. But these opportunities remained largely invisible to mainstream agricultural economics and policy systems that continued to prioritize industrial production over genetic diversity. Research institutions were beginning to document the superior environmental performance and resource Efficiency of traditional livestock breeds compared to commercial animals that had been bred for optimal performance only in controlled industrial environments, revealing that traditional breeding programs had maintained genetic advantages that could address climate change and environmental challenges. The scientific community was developing new appreciation for traditional breeding knowledge and practical expertise that had been preserved by farming families like the Morrisons, recognizing that traditional agricultural wisdom represented sophisticated problem-solving systems that had been tested and refined. Through generations of practical application under varying conditions, Daniel's careful maintenance of breeding records and genetic documentation was preserving exactly the kind of information that researchers needed to understand traditional livestock genetics and breeding methods, but conventional agricultural systems and institutional networks had not yet developed effective mechanisms for recognizing or accessing this traditional knowledge. The economic value of genetic resources and traditional breeding knowledge was beginning to be recognized by venture capital investors and biotechnology companies that were shifting their focus from purely technological solutions toward hybrid approaches that combine traditional knowledge with modern genetic science and biotechnology applications. Agricultural policy experts were beginning to recognize that traditional farming operations, like Daniel's, represented crucial insurance against agricultural collapse and genetic bottlenecks that threatened industrial livestock systems, but government support programs and agricultural assistance remained focused primarily on corporate agriculture and technological optimization. The international trade in genetic resources and traditional livestock breeds was beginning to develop as countries recognized the value of preserving agricultural diversity and traditional knowledge that could be essential for addressing global food security challenges and climate change adaptation in agricultural systems. Daniel's daily care of Titan and commitment to traditional breeding programs was preserving genetic resources and agricultural knowledge that would soon be recognized as extraordinarily valuable by research institutions and biotechnology companies. But the true economic and scientific significance of his inheritance remained completely invisible to Ventional agricultural assessment and economic valuation systems. As Sebastian continued to build his technology empire while dismissing traditional farming as economically obsolete, the genetic resources that Daniel was quietly preserving were about to attract attention from agricultural scientists and biotechnology researchers who would recognize Titan as representing one of the most valuable livestock specimens in modern agricultural history, carrying genetic characteristics that could revolutionize global food production and sustainable agriculture. The stage was set for a dramatic revelation that would expose the true value of traditional farming wisdom while demonstrating the limitations of purely technological approaches to agricultural innovation, ultimately leading to one of the most shocking reversals of fortune in modern agricultural history, as the worthless lame ox that Sebastian had mocked would soon be recognized as carrying genetic secrets worth billions of dollars. 18 months after Sebastian Morrison's cruel mockery of his brother's worthless lame ox inheritance, Dr. Sebastian Rodriguez, leading agricultural geneticist from the University of Wisconsin's pioneering livestock research program, stood in Daniel Morrison's modest farmyard staring at Titan with the kind of scientific awe typically reserved for discovering new species or unlocking fundamental secrets of life itself, completely unaware that her routine genetic survey of traditional Wisconsin farms was about to expose one of the most valuable agricultural discoveries in modern history. Dr. Chun Rodriguez's research project, funded by a $2.8 million grant from the National Science Foundation, specifically focused on documenting and preserving traditional livestock genetics before corporate agricultural consolidation eliminated the remaining genetic diversity that family farms had maintained through generations of careful breeding and agricultural wisdom that modern science was finally beginning to recognize as irreplaceable. The genetic sampling program that had brought Dr. Chun Rodriguez to the Morrison farm was part of a comprehensive effort to map traditional livestock genetics throughout the upper Midwest, with particular focus on European breed imports that might carry genetic characteristics that had been eliminated from commercial livestock through industrial breeding programs that prioritized rapid growth and standardized production over genetic diversity and traditional characteristics. Daniel's initial reluctance to participate in genetic testing reflected traditional farmers' skepticism about academic research and government programs that historically had promoted corporate agriculture while dismissing traditional farming knowledge. But Dr. Chun Rodriguez's respectful approach and genuine interest in preserving traditional breeding programs had gradually earned his trust and cooperation. The DNA samples that Dr. Chun Rodriguez collected from Titan and submitted to the university's Advanced Genetic Analysis Laboratory were processed using cutting-edge genomic sequencing technology that could identify genetic markers, trace bloodline heritage, and detect genetic variations that had never been systematically studied in traditional livestock populations maintained by family farming operations. 3 weeks after the initial sampling, Dr. Chun Rodriguez received laboratory results that caused her to immediately cancel her other research appointments and return to the Morrison farm with a team of genetic specialists, agricultural economists, and biotechnology experts who needed to verify what appeared to be one of the most significant agricultural genetic discoveries in recent history. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Chun Rodriguez announced with barely controlled excitement as she arrived at Daniel's farm with her research team. We need to talk about Titan. What you've been caring for isn't just a traditional Piedmontese bullies, carrying genetic characteristics that we've never seen before in modern livestock populations, genetic markers that biotechnology companies have been spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to artificially recreate. The genetic analysis that Dr. Chun Rodriguez presented to Daniel revealed that Titan possessed not only the classic myostatin inhibition that characterized traditional Piedmontese cattle, but also additional genetic variations that enhanced disease resistance, environmental adaptability, and reproductive efficiency in ways that exceeded all known livestock genetics and represented natural genetic advantages that modern agricultural science had never documented. Your family's breeding program has preserved genetic combinations that we thought were extinct, Dr. Chun Rodriguez explained while reviewing detailed genetic charts and laboratory analysis that demonstrated Titan's extraordinary genetic profile. These genetic markers suggest adaptations to climate stress, disease resistance, nutritional efficiency that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture and address global food security challenges. The economic implications that Dr. Chun Rodriguez outlined for Daniel included conservative estimates that Titan's genetic resources could be worth over $50 million in immediate biotechnology licensing agreements, with potential long-term value exceeding $500 million if his genetic characteristics could be successfully incorporated into commercial livestock populations through ethical breeding programs, rather than genetic engineering. The research team that Dr. Chun Rodriguez assembled to study Titan's genetics included some of the world's leading experts in livestock genetics, agricultural biotechnology, and sustainable food production, with representatives from major universities, biotechnology corporations, and international agricultural organizations who recognized that the Morrison farm had become the center of potentially revolutionary agricultural research. Dr. Michael Thompson Kim from MIT's Agricultural Biotechnology Institute confirmed that Titan's genetic profile included natural myostatin inhibition, combined with enhanced immune system genetics that provided disease resistance capabilities that pharmaceutical companies had been attempting to develop through expensive drug treatments and genetic modification programs. Professor Alina Rodriguez-Singh from Cornell University's Department of Agricultural Sciences documented that Titan's genetics included environmental adaptability markers that enabled superior performance under varying climate conditions, suggesting that his bloodline could be crucial for developing climate-resistant livestock that could maintain productivity as global environmental conditions became increasingly challenging. Dr. James Chen Martinez from the International Agricultural Research Institute verified that Titan's nutritional efficiency genetics enabled him to convert feed into lean protein at rates that exceeded commercial livestock by 340%, with environmental benefits that could reduce the carbon footprint of livestock production by up to 60% compared to industrial beef production systems. The biotechnology companies that learned about Titan's genetics through academic research networks immediately began approaching Daniel with licensing offers and partnership proposals that started at $10 million and quickly escalated to over $75 million as competitive bidding developed among corporations that recognized the revolutionary potential of his genetic resources. Recombinetics, the agricultural biotechnology company that had spent over $45 million attempting to develop artificial myostatin inhibition, offered Daniel a $25 million immediate payment plus 15% royalties on all future applications of Titan's genetics in commercial livestock production. Recognizing that his natural genetic variations exceeded anything they had achieved through laboratory manipulation, eGenesis, backed by pharmaceutical giant Novo Nordisk, proposed a $40 million research partnership that would preserve Titan's genetic line while developing applications for both agricultural production and medical treatments with potential pharmaceutical applications that could generate billions in revenue while maintaining ethical treatment of the genetic source. Aqua Bounty Technologies, the first company to receive FDA approval for genetically modified food animals, offered Daniel a $60 million buyout for exclusive rights to Titan's genetics, recognizing that his natural genetic advantages could eliminate the regulatory challenges and public opposition that genetically modified livestock faced in commercial markets. The pharmaceutical industry's interest in Titan's genetics extended beyond agricultural applications to include potential treatments for human muscle-wasting diseases, age-related muscle loss, and metabolic disorders, with multiple pharmaceutical companies offering research partnerships that could generate hundreds of millions in revenue, while advancing medical treatments through natural genetic research. Meanwhile, Sebastian Morrison's agricultural technology empire began experiencing systematic collapse as his corporate clients discovered that traditional livestock genetics like Titan's could provide superior results compared to the artificial intelligence algorithms and precision breeding systems that Morrison Digital Solutions had promoted as revolutionary agricultural innovation. The venture capital investors who had funded Sebastian's company with over $45 million began demanding explanations for why sophisticated technological systems had failed to identify or replicate the genetic advantages that a traditional farmer had preserved through methods that Sebastian had systematically dismissed as economically obsolete and scientifically backward. Corporate agricultural clients like Cargill, Tyson Foods, and Archer Daniels Midland began canceling contracts with Morrison Digital Solutions as they recognized that traditional breeding knowledge and genetic preservation offered more valuable solutions than artificial intelligence optimization and technological automation that had failed to address fundamental genetic limitations in industrial livestock. The agricultural technology industry that had celebrated Sebastian as an innovative leader began recognizing that his systematic dismissal of traditional farming knowledge had caused him to overlook exactly the genetic resources and agricultural wisdom that could have revolutionized his technological systems. While providing sustainable solutions to global food challenges, Sebastian's professional reputation suffered devastating damage as agricultural media and technology publications reported that his family's own farm had preserved genetic resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars while he had built a technology company that systematically ignored traditional knowledge and genetic preservation in favor of artificial solutions that couldn't replicate natural genetic advantages. The $380 million valuation that Morrison Digital Solutions had achieved collapsed to under $45 million, as investors recognized that the company's technological approach had fundamental limitations compared to traditional breeding methods and genetic preservation programs that Sebastian had spent years publicly dismissing as intellectually inferior. Personal bankruptcy became inevitable for Sebastian as his technology company's failure eliminated his primary source of income while his luxury lifestyle and accumulated debts exceeded his remaining financial resources, forcing him to liquidate assets and dramatically reduce living expenses to levels that approached his brother's modest farming lifestyle. The social isolation that Sebastian experienced as his professional network abandoned him reflected the agricultural technology industry's recognition that his systematic bias against traditional farming had caused him to miss one of the most valuable agricultural opportunities in modern history while publicly humiliating the brother. who would preserve the genetic resources he needed. The media attention that surrounded Titan's genetic discovery eventually reached Sebastian through agricultural technology publications and venture capital networks that had previously supported his company, forcing him to confront the devastating reality that his cruel mockery of the lame ox had cost him access to genetic innovations worth more than his entire technology fortune. Agricultural media coverage consistently highlighted the irony that Sebastian Morrison, founder of a precision agricultural company, had systematically dismissed his own family's preservation of genetic resources that his technological systems had been designed to identify and optimize. Demonstrating fundamental limitations in artificial intelligence approaches to complex biological systems, the shame and regret that Sebastian experienced as he learned about the $380 million valuation that Morrison Digital Solutions had achieved collapsed to under $45 million. As investors recognized that the company's technological approach had fundamental limitations compared to traditional breeding methods and genetic preservation programs that Sebastian had spent years publicly dismissing as intellectually inferior. Personal bankruptcy became inevitable for Sebastian as his technology company's failure eliminated his primary source of income while his luxury lifestyle and accumulated debts exceeded his remaining financial resources, forcing him to liquidate assets and dramatically reduce living expenses to levels that approached his brother's modest farming lifestyle. The social isolation that Sebastian experienced as his professional network abandoned him reflected the agricultural technology industry's recognition that his systematic bias against traditional farming had caused him to miss one of the most valuable agricultural opportunities in modern history while publicly humiliating the brother who had preserved the genetic resources he needed. The media attention that surrounded Titan's genetic discovery eventually reached Sebastian through agricultural technology publications and venture capital networks that had previously supported his company, forcing him to confront the devastating reality that his cruel mockery of the lame ox had cost him access to genetic innovations worth more than his entire technology fortune. Agricultural media coverage consistently highlighted the irony that Sebastian Morrison, founder of a precision agricultural company, had systematically dismissed his own family's preservation of genetic resources that his technological systems had been designed to identify and optimize. Demonstrating fundamental limitations in artificial intelligence approaches to complex biological systems, the shame and regret that Sebastian experienced as he learned about Titan's true value included recognition that his systematic arrogance and dismissal of traditional farming had not only cost him massive financial opportunities, but it also damaged family relationships and violated the agricultural heritage that his ancestors had carefully preserved through generations of dedicated farming. Daniel's response to his brother's professional and financial collapse demonstrated the kind of generosity and family loyalty that characterized traditional farming communities. As he offered Sebastian opportunities to participate in the genetic research partnerships and biotechnology licensing agreements that Titan's discovery had generated. "I never wanted to see you fail, Seb," Daniel explained during their first conversation since the estate reading. As Sebastian visited the farm to witness firsthand the scientific teams and biotechnology representatives who now recognize Titan as one of the most valuable livestock specimens in agricultural history, Grandpa always said this bloodline was special, and now we know why. The reconciliation between the Morrison brothers occurred gradually as Sebastian began to understand the sophisticated knowledge and specialized expertise that traditional farming required. Recognizing that his dismissal of agricultural heritage had reflected his own ignorance rather than intellectual superiority over traditional methods and family wisdom, Sebastian's involvement in managing the biotechnology, partnerships, and licensing agreements that resulted from Titan's genetic discovery provided opportunities for him to apply his business skills and technological expertise while respecting traditional farming knowledge and genetic preservation programs that his family had maintained. The collaboration between traditional farming wisdom and modern biotechnology that developed on the Morrison farm created a model for sustainable agricultural innovation that combined genetic preservation with ethical research applications, demonstrating that traditional knowledge and modern science could work together rather than compete for agricultural advancement. The international recognition that Titan's genetics received from agricultural research. Institutions throughout the world established the Morrison Farm as a center for genetic preservation and sustainable agriculture research that attracted scientists, policymakers, and agricultural leaders who recognized the global implications of traditional breeding knowledge and genetic conservation. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization designated the Morrison Farm as a global heritage agricultural site, recognizing that Daniel's preservation of traditional genetics represented irreplaceable resources for addressing climate change, food security, and sustainable agriculture challenges that threaten global food systems and environmental sustainability. European agricultural institutions that had maintained traditional livestock genetics for centuries began establishing research partnerships with the Morrison Farm, creating international collaborations that documented and preserved traditional breeding knowledge while developing sustainable applications for modern agricultural challenges and environmental conservation. The biotechnology industry experienced fundamental changes as Titan's genetic discovery demonstrated that traditional breeding knowledge and natural genetic variations could provide superior solutions compared to expensive genetic engineering and laboratory manipulation, leading to increased investment in traditional genetic preservation and sustainable breeding programs. Agricultural universities throughout the world began modifying their curricula to include traditional farming knowledge and genetic preservation methods. Recognizing that conventional agricultural education had systematically overlooked practical expertise and traditional wisdom that could be crucial for addressing future agricultural challenges and environmental sustainability. Government agricultural policies began incorporating support for traditional farming operations and genetic preservation programs, with new funding mechanisms designed to recognize and preserve the genetic resources and traditional knowledge that family farming operations had maintained through generations of agricultural heritage and specialized expertise. The pharmaceutical industry's recognition of natural genetic variations as sources for medical treatments led to ethical research partnerships that provided substantial revenue for traditional farming operations while advancing medical science. Through sustainable and respectful approaches to genetic research and therapeutic development. 2 years after Sebastian Morrison's devastating mockery of his brother's worthless lame ox inheritance, the Morrison Farm had become the center of a $2.8 billion agricultural research and biotechnology development program that would revolutionize global food production while preserving traditional farming knowledge and demonstrating the extraordinary value of genetic conservation and family agricultural heritage. The congressional hearing that examined traditional agriculture and genetic preservation included testimony from Daniel Morrison, who was recognized as a national expert in livestock genetics and traditional breeding methods, with his farming operation serving as a model for sustainable agriculture and genetic conservation that could address global food security challenges. Sebastian Morrison's testimony before the same congressional committee included public acknowledgement of his systematic errors in dismissing traditional farming knowledge, with recommendations for policy changes that would support genetic preservation and traditional breeding programs while preventing the kind of institutional bias that had nearly cost. The economic value that Daniel Morrison's commitment to traditional farming ultimately generated exceeded $500 million in biotechnology licensing agreements, research partnerships, and agricultural innovation funding, demonstrating that traditional knowledge and genetic preservation could provide financial returns that exceeded sophisticated technology investments and corporate agricultural operations. The scientific discoveries that resulted from studying Titan's genetics led to breakthroughs in sustainable agriculture, climate-resistant livestock development, medical treatments that addressed global challenges while respecting traditional knowledge and maintaining ethical approaches to genetic research and agricultural innovation. The family reconciliation that occurred between the Morrison brothers demonstrated that humility, respect for traditional knowledge, and recognition of diverse forms of expertise could overcome even devastating personal conflicts and professional jealousy while creating opportunities for collaboration and mutual success. The agricultural revolution that began on the Morrison farm continues to influence global food production, genetic conservation, and sustainable agriculture development. With traditional farming knowledge now recognized as essential for addressing climate change, food security, and environmental sustainability challenges that threaten global agricultural systems. Daniel Morrison's quiet dedication to preserving his family's agricultural heritage and traditional breeding programs had ultimately preserved genetic resources worth billions of dollars, while demonstrating that traditional knowledge and patient stewardship could achieve results that sophisticated technology and massive corporate investment had been unable to replicate through artificial means. The worthless lame ox that Sebastian Morrison had mockingly dismissed as evidence of his brother's economic failure and intellectual limitation had become the foundation for agricultural innovations that would feed millions of people, while demonstrating that the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight, preserved by humble dedication and traditional wisdom that sophisticated arrogance fails to recognize or value. The Morrison brothers' story serves as a timeless reminder that true value often lies not in what appears most impressive or technologically advanced, but in what has been carefully preserved and lovingly maintained through generations of dedication, expertise, and respect for traditional knowledge that connects us to our agricultural heritage and provides foundations for sustainable innovation and meaningful contribution to global welfare. The legacy of Titan, the Bull, and the Morrison family's traditional farming wisdom continues to influence agricultural development throughout the world, proving that sometimes the most valuable inheritances are those that appear worthless to sophisticated eyes but contain genetic treasures and traditional knowledge that can change the world when recognized, respected, and properly applied to address humanity's greatest challenges and opportunities for sustainable development. In the end, Sebastian Morrison learned that true wealth lies not in dismissing what we don't understand, but in recognizing that wisdom takes many forms, value can be hidden in unexpected places, and the greatest innovations often come from combining traditional knowledge with modern science rather than replacing heritage with technology or family connections with corporate success. The Morrison farm stands today as a testament to the power of traditional knowledge, the importance of genetic preservation, and the extraordinary value that can result from humble dedication to family heritage and agricultural wisdom that connects us to our past while providing solutions for our future challenges and opportunities for sustainable prosperity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.